Many of you are aware, yesterday evening, London suffered the devastating loss of 4 members of our community and the serious injury of 1 other. The incident occurred when a vehicle struck these citizens as they walked along Hyde Park Road, where it intersects with South Carriage Road. London police officers and other emergency services quickly attended the scene, commenced life-saving efforts, and entered into an investigation. I'm also able to tell you at this time that based on information collected during the course of the investigation, we believe that this was an intentional act and that the victims of this horrific incident were targeted. We believe the victims were targeted because of their Islamic faith.
On July 22nd, 2018, a man called Faisal Hussein walked down a busy Toronto boulevard called the Danforth, home to lots of restaurants. It's a beautiful summer evening. People were outside on patios. Took a gun, started shooting, ended up killing 2 people, including a young woman, and wounded several dozen before he took his own life. The immediate aftermath of this attack, there were calls everywhere for, this is an act of terrorism, this is an act of jihadism. He was a Canadian Muslim, therefore he must have been a terrorist. Despite a year-long investigation by Toronto police and others, there was no determination that in fact this was an act of terrorism. In fact, they never determined a motive. These people died and we don't know why. Fast forward to yesterday, June the 7th, 2021, when a young man, 20 years old, in London, Ontario, which happens to be my hometown, at 8 o'clock in the evening, jumped the curb while driving a truck down a road in the west end of town, part of town I know very well, ended up striking a family of 5, killing 4, and wounding 1. London police arrested him shortly afterwards, and they came out with a statement saying that this seemed to be a deliberate act, it was a premeditated act, and they believe it may in fact have been hate motivated. All of the victims were Muslim. They were Canadian Muslims. London police also noted that there is the possibility that terrorism charges could be laid in this particular case. Not surprisingly, this has made news all around the world. It's on the front page of the BBC this morning. It's dominating Canadian media for obvious reasons. This is a horrendous act of violence. It's a heinous act. It's a cowardly act by a young man who targeted a family who were defenseless in his truck. But the bottom line, the question that's bothering a lot of people right now is, what do we call this? Do we call it murder? First-degree murder, as it appears to be premeditated? Do we call it a hate crime? Or do we call it terrorism? So let's unpack those 3 things right now. Under Canadian law, as far as I understand it, I'm not a lawyer, first-degree murder is the intentional act of killing another individual. In this case, now obviously the person is entitled to his defense. That appears to be true. So that's going to be fairly straightforward to determine in a court of law. The second element, a hate crime, is covered under Section 319 of the Canadian Criminal Code, and it refers to an act which targets a particular individual or individuals because of their race, religion, ethnicity, sexual orientation, etc., etc., etc. And there's an interesting aspect of Canadian law. It's covered under Section 718 of the Criminal Code, which allows a judge to take into consideration the reasons for which a crime was committed. And if it can be demonstrated beyond reasonable doubt that the crime was hate in nature, it targeted certain individuals, then the judge has the authority under law to increase the sentence. Now, it has to be determined that the suspect carried out his act deliberately against this group because of what he perceived them to be. In this case, immigrants, Canadian Muslims, brown-skinned people. I don't know. I don't have any information in that regard. But that's what the Crown, the prosecution in Canada, has to demonstrate. Terrorism is something quite different. That is covered under Section 83.01 of the Criminal Code, and it says that act of terrorism is a serious act of violence that is planned or carried out for political ideological, or religious reasons. That's a fairly high bar to demonstrate. Not only do you have to figure out that an act was planned or carried out, you have to determine why it was carried out. What is the motivation? What is the underlying cause? What was going on through a person's head when this act was planned or executed? And that's not always easy. Police forces are not mind readers. They don't have instruments that can detect what's going on in your head. So in this case, what's going to happen is the police are doing their investigation. The suspect was never, he was known to police, but he has no criminal record. He's quite young. We know nothing about his background. Neighbors have said he was quiet, introverted. That's all we know. What were his belief systems? What was his social circle? Who were his friends? Who did he associate with in the real world and online? What websites did he visit? What websites did he post on? We know nothing about that right now. That is what the investigation is going to have to determine. The fact that the police have said this was a premeditated possible hate crime suggests to me that the suspect has said something when he was arrested. But again, I don't know. That has not been made public. Or perhaps the police found something on his person when he was arrested. Again, I don't know that. It hasn't been made public.
I'm able to tell you that all of the victims in this matter are members of the same family. The deceased include a 74-year-old female, a 46-year-old male, a 44-year-old female, and a 15-year-old female. One 9-year-old male, the sole survivor, remains in hospital with serious injuries, not considered life-threatening.
There is a jumping on the bandwagon effect as of the day after. This is now June the 8th, 2021. People calling this an act of terrorism and demanding that he be charged with terrorism under the Canadian Criminal Code. I'm not one of those people on the bandwagon for the simple reason I don't have the facts at hand. And I'm guessing most of the people that are calling for terrorism don't have the facts either. This is why we do investigations. This is why we uncover every rock to find out what's there. Again, the police, the Crown, the prosecution has to determine that the primary reason why this terrible, heinous act of violence, cowardly act of violence was carried out was because the individual was motivated by a political, ideological, or religious underpinning. And as I've tried to remind people over the past 24 hours, hate and terrorism are not synonymous. Most terrorist ideologies, be they political, religious, or whatever in nature, tend to have large dollops of hate within them. Terrorism is imbued with hate. But not all hate is terrorism. Lots of hateful movements aren't terrorist in nature. Terrorism is a subset of hate, not vice versa. The other thing that I've been criticized for is not calling it terrorism because it was a terrible, terrifying event. Absolutely, it was terrifying. Seeing innocent people mowed down by a truck out for a late evening stroll on a humid day. But terrifying is not synonymous with terrorism. Armed gangs are terrifying. They're not terrorists. Organized crime is terrifying. Organized criminals are not terrorists. I'm not trying to split hairs here when it comes to what to describe this particular act of violence as. All I'm trying to do is point out that there are reasons why we have criminal codes and there are reasons why we have investigations. It may in fact turn out, at the end of the day, that this individual was indeed radicalized to violence, as NDP leader Jagmeet Singh has already stated publicly, categorically. I don't know what evidence Mr. Singh has, because it sure as heck isn't in my inbox. If that turns out to be the case, then yes, terrorism charges will be warranted. If it turns out he was not motivated by an ideology or a political system or a religion, but by purely hate, then a hate crime charge is warranted. If it turns out that this is just a random killing by a man who wanted to kill, then first-degree murder charges are warranted in this case. We have to wait and see what the evidence comes up with. We have to wait and see what the police investigation comes up with.
A black pickup truck occupied by a lone male traveling southbound on Hyde Park Road mounted the curb and struck the 5 victims waiting to cross the intersection. The pickup truck continued to drive southbound on Hyde Park Road at a high rate of speed. It was observed to turn left on Oxford Street, not stopping for the red light. Several 911 calls were received, and police, fire, and paramedic services were immediately dispatched to the scene.
Drawing our own conclusions is not helpful at this point. I understand people they're upset. They're very saddened at what has happened. I understand a lot of reporting on Islamophobia in Canada, other attacks that have taken place in Canada. Yes, they're happening. And this is a problem in our country and it has to be dealt with. But we cannot jump to conclusions this early in a case that just broke a little more than 24 hours ago, 36 hours ago. We have to wait for the facts to come in. My heart goes out to the relatives, to the 9-year-old boy who's clinging to life. He's lost his parents. He's lost his grandparents, I understand. This is, as I said, a cowardly act of violence by a young man for reasons as yet unknown. And he will have his day in court. And if all goes well, he will be found guilty and he will serve a very long time behind bars. But we have other ways of dealing with this in Canadian law. Alexandre Bissonnette, the man who killed 6 Muslims in a mosque in Quebec City in January 2017. In my mind, that was an act of terrorism. He was not charged with terrorism. He was charged with first-degree murder, and he got a 40-year sentence. Alec Manassian, the guy who drove his van down Yonge Street in April 2018, killing 10 or 11. He was not charged with terrorism. He was found guilty of first-degree murder. That was not an act of terrorism. That was an act of hateful misogyny at best, and even that is borderline, if you read the judgment in that case. All I'm calling for is a dispassionate, objective look at the facts at hand before we draw our conclusions. Anyhow, my heart goes out to the family. This is a terrible event from my hometown. And I hope we come up with a resolution to it. And I hope that we can put in place measures so it doesn't happen again. If you want to send me feedback on this particular podcast, you can reach me on email, borealisrisk@gmail.com, or on Twitter @borealissaves. You can also find me on LinkedIn and on Facebook. If you like the content, want to get more, go to borealisthreatrisk.com, hit the subscribe button. You'll get a daily digest, Today in Terrorism, podcasts such as these, longer Canadian Intelligence Day, and other material. You'll also find a link to my new book, The Peaceable Kingdom, A History of Terrorism in Canada from Confederation to the Present. I'll talk to you again soon. Until then, stay safe.